Welcome to everybody, and thank you very much for being here with us. You know, the Institute for Human Sciences is doing a lot of brave and creative things, but we're going to start something new, which we hope is going to be even more interesting and crazy than the things that normally we're doing. We are starting together with the Ministry of Defense of Syria of 6 big talks about the geopolitical changes in the world. And we decided to get people who are not simply researching this, but who have a kind of a first-hand experience from different positions in the foreign policy decision-making, how much the world is changing, what it means for us, how, by the way, it is going to affect those of us doing research and those of us being researched. We're going to have a really great line of people, including the former Turkish Prime Minister, Mr. Davutoglu, who is going to be here next week, the former senior American diplomat, Bill Burns. We are going to have Mr. Karaganov, who is the head of the Russian Council on Defense Policies, basically people who are going to come from the point of view of a big countries, great powers, and through them we try to understand how the world is changing and how to make sense of this change. The person who is going to start these talks, and this is a great pleasure for me, is John Sawyers. He had a great biography for more than 30 years, being a British civil servant in one of the most interesting places that you can imagine. He was an ambassador to Egypt. He was a foreign policy advisor to the British Prime Minister. He was a British ambassador in the United Nations. He was the political secretary of the British Foreign Office, and of course, what is, of course, I do believe one of the most intriguing things for everybody who is watching thrillers these days. For 5 years, he was the head of the British intelligence. He was the head of MI6. But the reason we decided to start with him, and I have the pleasure to know him, is that I do believe he is one of the very few people that can bring together the political analysis, the economic analysis, and basically try to combine different views, not just to say how the world is changing for Britain or for Europe, but how the change looks from places that we normally not talk about, be it Saudi Arabia, be it Australia, be it the United States. So what we're going to do is, for 30 minutes, John is going to give us his big picture talk. Then I will try to very briefly to interrogate him on certain things that he has been talking, and then we are going basically to join the conversation with you. And thank you very much for being here, and welcome to John Sawyers.
Well, thank you, Ivan. Thank you very much indeed for that very warm introduction. Thank you, Shalini, for inviting me here to open this series of talks, and it's a great pleasure to be back in Vienna, a city which I visited many times in a number of those jobs that you described, perhaps most frequently when I was political director in the Foreign Office when we were negotiating with the Iranians back in 2003 to 2006 on their nuclear program, and I used to come here and we had many unproductive discussions and some quite productive discussions on that process back then. But it's a great pleasure to be here. And of course, as a former chief of MI6, Vienna has a special sort of special meaning for us. This was a real center of espionage in the Cold War. One of the most brilliant and sophisticated and early technical operations was carried out very much here in Vienna by the MI6 station when they tapped into the military communications of Russian headquarters with the Russian field units. And it produced the most remarkable body of tactical intelligence of what the Russians were doing. So successful, and the CIA was so envious of this that they insisted that we and the CIA do a joint operation in Berlin, which was a very equally successful in an even more important location for the Russian military. Unfortunately, both operations, after several years of great success, were blown by a Russian double agent in MI6, George Blake, and it was a classic example of Cold War espionage here in your capital, and of course much of it was captured in the Third Man. And we all thought the Cold War had ended in 1989, but I found the spirit of Harry Lime lived on, because when I was chief of MI6, we sent some of our senior Russian operations people here for a classic spy swap in 2010 at Vienna airport. Nobody could quite believe we still did these things with the Russians, but Anna Chapman and 9, I think, other Russian sleeper agents in the United States was swapped with for 4 people who I can't obviously confirm anything, but shall I say were convicted by the Russians for spying for MI6 and the CIA. Of course, there was a history of these things, and people respected each side. But Sergei Skripal was one of those people who was swapped at Vienna airport back in 2010, and was then 8 years later targeted by a most vicious nerve agent attack in Salisbury, which clearly was carried out by the Russian GRU, as we saw from the evidence that was pieced together afterwards. And it highlighted a not very attractive fact of the modern world, is that you could rely on the Soviet Union to adhere to their commitments more than you can rely on modern-day Russia to adhere to its commitments. So that's a rather sort of sobering thought to start this conversation. But I've not actually come here today to talk about espionage. It's more about the position of Europe as we are now at the end of the second decade of this century. I was reminded of being British. I like understatement. There was a sort of classic Japanese understatement when the Japanese surrendered at the end of the Second World War, when Emperor Hirohito said that after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he said that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Fortunately, Europe has not suffered nuclear strikes on our territory, but I think it's probably true to say that the situation in the world as a whole has developed not necessarily to Europe's advantage. And we need to think about this. It's been a slower burn process, but the trends in the world, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, have put Europe in a disadvantaged position, which we need to think about quite carefully. Now, where do we start on this? I think the right place to start is probably the most dramatic change in the global situation that we've seen in the last 50 years, which is the rise of China. And here's the most remarkable story, the way that China has grown at sort of 8 to 10% a year for the last 40 years. It now has, in purchasing power terms, an economy which is greater than that of the United States. Purchasing power is a slightly misleading. It's a sort of measure of welfare rather than real hard power. But even then, in 10 years' time, on the present trajectory, China will overtake the United States in dollar terms, in terms of the weight of the Chinese economy. And it is a truly remarkable achievement. And it was devised and driven by Deng Xiaoping, who, when he effectively came to power in 1979, devised a mindset which he captured in 1990 in what is known as his 24-character guidance to Chinese leaders, and which carried on all through his life and for another 15 years after he died. It was the guidance as to how China should comport itself in the world. And what he said in 1990 was the following. He said, "Observe calmly, secure your position, cope with affairs calmly, hide your capacities, bide your time, maintain a low profile, and never claim leadership." And that was known as hide and bide. Bide your time, hide your capabilities. And it was followed up until 2012. And during that era, the West supported the rise of China. We were actively engaged in its economic growth. It was a driver of global growth. And it was gradually moving to accept the international system and to adapt itself and modify itself to be part of the international system, such that Bob Zoellick, the then Deputy Secretary at the State Department, described the aspiration for China to be a responsible stakeholder in the world. And indeed, China was becoming gradually more open, greater debate about the policy in China through the periods of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. But this changed in 2012. In 2012, Xi Jinping became leader of China, reversed many of the trends which had been set up under Deng. He reversed the fundamental constraints that Deng had put in place to prevent a new Mao Zedong emerging, the age limits and the term limits for Chinese leaders. He's concentrated power on himself so that Chinese premiers, who used to be really important, like Zhu Rongji or Wen Jiabao, the current Chinese premier, Li Keqiang, counts for nothing, virtually. And the standing committee of the Communist Party is a rubber stamping process. There is only one person, only one decision maker in China, and that's Xi Jinping. And so the sort of calculation that we made that China would become more like us progressively has shown, certainly for now, to be wrong. And we should expect Xi Jinping to be in power for the next 10, 15 years, a bit like President Putin. When you're there for that length of time, it's very hard to see a change coming about. And Chinese behavior has changed externally as well. We see it in the South China Sea. We see it in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an important strategic initiative by China. But let's remember, it has strategic goals as well as commercial and economic objectives. It's a bit like the Marshall Plan was after the Second World War. It's about building up economies, but locking them in to a Western model. And in the Marshall Plan's case, in this case, it's about locking them in to a Chinese model, and it has a strategic sort of underpinning to it as well. So what's America's response? Well, it actually started under Obama with the pivot to Asia. We're seeing a much more direct, confrontational approach to China than we've seen from previous American leaders. We're seeing it in the trade dimension, which I think will get resolved in the next month or so. I don't think we're going to see an all-out trade war between the US and China. But if you read the speech by Vice President Pence last October, you understand that the mindset in America towards China has really hardened. And there's this sense of that China's state power, orchestrated state power, is determined for China to master all the most important technologies in the world and not just be able to protect its own interest, but be able to control those technologies in the world in the years to come. There was a time when China's route to technological advancement was to steal Western technology and reverse engineer it. They now have their own capacity to develop technology highly effectively, and they have their own global technology companies, which are very effective as well, and of course can be instrumentalized by the Chinese state. So the rise of China is a really massive development that we're seeing. I've described America's response to China, but of course America too is changing in a very fundamental way. I think we can become a bit obsessed by the personality of Donald Trump, and he is obviously a very difficult and not very attractive personality, but more British understatement. But he's a consequence of changes that have taken place in America. He's not the cause of them. He arose because the changes in the American economy, the changes in the way technology is impacting on the lives of ordinary Americans, has proved deeply divisive. By and large, the people on the coasts with good education and in professional jobs have thrived, and many of those in middle America have struggled. And one of the most telling statistics of recent years is that the median wage of a full-time male worker in the United States was higher in 1973 than it was in 2016. And that's in a context where the US economy has more than doubled, almost tripled in size in that period. And it's a remarkable, indictment, really, but also a description of why these tensions have emerged in American society. I cannot conceive, not just of President Trump, but actually any future American leader saying what President Kennedy said in 1961, that America will pay any price and bear any burden to protect freedom and democracy in the world. America has just moved beyond that. It is not the mindset of modern America to carry the global system with it. And what we see in the rather abrupt change from the nice intellectual President Obama to the rather coarse and blunt and aggressive President Trump is that sort of that sharp change. It sort of captures that change, which has been happening over a number of years, where America is going to act in its own national interest as a nationalist power and demand reciprocity and equality from others. It is not going to carry the global system with it. So you're seeing these two major powers, United States and China, who will be the dominant powers of the 21st century, acting in rather similar way of an aggressive, confrontational approach. And we also see Russia trying to, or aspiring to be on the top table alongside the United States and China as part of a sort of global triumvirate to resolve international security questions. Now, of course, the Russian economy is smaller than that of Spain. And it's not going to grow very rapidly because President Putin has set his mind against economic reform. Economic reform leads to losers as well as winners. And he can't afford to have losers in Russia because they become discontents and you end up with unrest and unhappiness, as we saw captured to some extent by the reaction to the changes in pension rights in Russia. So Putin is not going to reform Russia so it can grow at sort of 5 or 6% a year. It will bubble along at 1 or 2%, a low rate. But he has this goal of re-establishing Russia as a world power, able to stand toe-to-toe with the United States. And you're also seeing, partly as a reaction to Trump, that Russia and China, who used to sort of pay lip service to working with one another. I used to see at the United Nations, sitting on the Security Council, the Russians and Chinese would cooperate with each other, support each other on a tactical basis. But I think that's got more developed in recent years. They both share concerns about their vulnerability because they're both connected to the global internet. Very interesting what President Putin is doing at the moment, experimenting with separating off Russia from the global internet so that it can stand alone and have its own Russian internet. And I think we'll see the Chinese probably experimenting in the same direction. And once they've mastered these experiments, I think we should expect that what Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, described as the splinter net, i.e. the internet splintering, becoming a reality. I also think the Russians and Chinese have a very shared concern that they're vulnerable to the dollar's dominant role in the global economy. And they will try to find a way to reduce, even if it costs them financially, to reduce their dependence on the dollar and reduced America's leverage over Russia and China as a result of using the dollar. Now, obviously, the Chinese would like to trade in renminbi. But even trading in other currencies like the euro or the yen or whatever is preferable to having everything in terms of dollars. And I think one reason why, for example, you mentioned Saudi Arabia in your introduction, the Saudis were toying at one stage of, or they declared it as a plan to privatize part of Aramco. And the Chinese were really interested in that, not because they really wanted a part of a big Saudi oil company. What they wanted in exchange was a reliable flow of oil and gas from the Middle East, which they would buy in renminbi and not in dollars. And there was a deal there that China and Saudi Arabia could make with each other, which would be against the strategic interests of the United States. So it hasn't happened. I don't think it will happen now. But it's interesting how China and Russia are both working in that direction. So what does this mean? We have Russia, as I say, trying to establish itself at the top table. It's mastered a series of skills in cyber operations, in propaganda. It's always been good at propaganda, but it's developed it to a new art. Assassinations, as we know very well. Destabilization and manipulation of Western social media, as we've seen in a series of interference in Western elections, above all in that in the United States in 2016. Be interesting to see what Bob Mueller reports in a week or so's time. Although I don't think it's going to be devastating. I think it will just be an unsavory narrative that we see from Mueller. But we may talk about that a bit later. But the Russians have got a mindset that if the West is doing well, that's bad for Russia. And if the West is doing badly, well, that's good for Russia. So their goal, their objective, and their tactical plans are geared to dividing, undermining, and weakening the West, including weakening Europe, as much as it is to build Russia's strategic strengths. And some of those limits that were put in place on Russian behavior during the Cold War, one by one are falling away. Largely, that has to be said by the United States. We used to have a network of treaties between the Soviet Union and the West, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the START nuclear the arms reduction, the strategic arms reduction negotiations, and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement. They've all been, one by one, pushed aside with only one left, and that's START, and that falls due in 2021. I don't think this will herald an immediate arms race. And there was a sort of, to some extent, a logic behind each of them. But a logic behind the decisions by the United States and Russia to set each of them aside. With the INF Treaty, the most recent, they were concerned that the Chinese were unconstrained by this, as well as by the fact that the Russians had been breaching the treaty. But the mindset is different. During the Cold War and in the 1990s, we tried to find agreement to constrain one another's power so that we could all live in peace. The mindset now is to take those constraints off and let the most powerful country prevail. So we're not yet in a future arms race, but the groundwork has been laid for a potential arms race ahead. So this is a challenge, obviously, for us. And across these interplays between great powers, you have the rise of technology, the changing technology, which has affected, transformed all our lives. When I became chief of MI6 in 2009, and the service was just mastering what we call big data and data analytics. And during my early years as chief, it completely transformed the business of conducting intelligence operations. And to put it in sort of film terms, instead of the most important person in the intelligence operations team, being the James Bond guy out in the field who's conducting the operation, the most important person was Q, who had the technology, had the data, could analyze the data, and the hierarchy in the intelligence team shifted, and the data analyst became the most important person in the team. And you're seeing that, intelligence is a weird business, but you're seeing it in all businesses, whether you're in professional services, whether you're in banking, whether you're in manufacturing. Big data has changed the way in which the economy functions. We're now in the world, 10 years later, of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which again is having a transformative effect on the way businesses are thinking. We're seeing blockchain technology becoming an essential part of how many businesses operate. For many people, me included, I only have a hazy understanding of how all this works. But what I do know is it's going to be deeply transformative. And down the road, we've got quantum computing. Now, a question for us to ask ourselves, is, will this technology be harnessed in a way that reinforces the advantages of a market economy, or will it rather play to the strengths of a centrally controlled autocratic system? Anyone who's been to Beijing or Shanghai in the last few years is struck by the extraordinary surveillance system that is now in place in China. And this isn't, we have closed-circuit television in London. I'm sure you have it here in Vienna. And when Skripal's attackers were being sought, you could play back those tapes to find out the every movement of these individuals. It's a good retrospective record to examine and study. But in China, they use it in real time to monitor and control their people. What Xi Jinping's security apparatus has put in place is a system of surveillance and control that Joseph Stalin would have died for. Much more effective, much less brutal, but much more powerful. And so that technology in which data can be harnessed, collected, aggregated, and analyzed with no care about privacy is something which will strengthen centrally controlled systems more than it helps Western economies. When the central element of power was the performance of the market economy and the allocation of capital, the Western system prevailed because our system of dispersed decision-making was a whole lot more effective and produced much better results than any centrally planned economy could produce. We can't be quite so confident that in the 21st century, dispersed decision-making in the market economy will prevail over a central system. So you have these technology changes. You have the rise of China. You have changes in other countries, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, some of your neighbors here in Central Europe, where that trend towards liberal democracy and the consolidation of market economy, which we thought in the 1990s and 2000s was really the natural destination for the world. This is where we were all heading. There were some slow coaches that were coming along that road rather more reluctantly than others, but we're all heading to the same destination. Plural liberal democracy, market economy. You now have an alternative model, which is autocratic politics, led by big man leaders, I'm afraid they are men, all of them, and state capitalism. And this model of autocracy and state capitalism, as opposed to liberal democracy and market economics, is going to be a big competition over the years ahead. And we can't presume, as we did in 1989, that the outcome of that is determined. So that's a fairly sort of gloomy set of factors that we need to weigh in all this. And we need to think, well, how does Europe respond to all this? Europe has been the many ways the greatest beneficiary of the global order since 1945. There have only really been 3 global orders that I can think of. Maybe Ivan, who's a better historian than I am, can think of more. But you have the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which came after the grotesque brutality of the 30 Years' War. You have the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which came after the violence and disruption of the Napoleonic Wars. And you have the post-1945 settlement, which came after 2 world wars. They're basically the only 3 global orders. And as is clear, each of them was forged in the ashes of a most horrific conflict. So let's not wish for another horrific conflict to build a 4th global order. Let's try and preserve what we've got from the 3rd global order, namely the post-1945 settlement, which has enabled us to have an extraordinary capacity to grow, to forge the European Union, to develop under an umbrella of peace and instability here in Europe, because the trends I've described are all ones which make Europe's security and predictability that much harder. And now we're not helped by my country. It's nice to escape from Brexit Britain. Happy to answer questions on Brexit at some point. But Brexit itself is a phenomenon across Western politics where, because of the unequal benefits from globalization and from automation, you've got a divided society. And you've got a grievance that many people have against their governments, which has expressed itself in different ways in different countries. In America, it expressed itself in Trump, in Britain, in Brexit, in France through the Gilets jaunes. We're fortunate that Macron won that election, but 40% of French people voted for either Jean-Luc Mélenchon or for Le Pen, Marine Le Pen. 40%. You're seeing it with the rise of extreme right parties in Germany and Spain. You're seeing it in illiberal nationalism in Hungary and Poland. You're seeing it in a weird coalition in Italy between the hard right and the populist left. And what this is doing is it's making it harder, all these issues are making it harder for Europe's leaders to think about what is really happening in the world and how Europe as a whole should be responding to this. In the years ahead. Now, I think here in Austria, you've got a very interesting example of a new politician. He's controversial, but he is finding a path of sort of conservative policy which taps into some of the resentments and grievances, but he's managing to ride that. We're all going to follow that with a lot of interest. We're going to follow how AKK succeeds Merkel in Germany. We're going to follow how Macron recovers from the shock of the Gilets jaunes. And I certainly am going to follow closely how my country recovers from the disruption caused by Brexit, which I think is going to happen one way or another. And all this makes it difficult for Europe to think about these global issues. Now, Europe isn't a major military power. We don't aspire to be one, and I think that's right. We don't want to end up developing a capacity to compete with the United States or China or Russia as a military assertive force. But that doesn't mean we can continue to freeload on the Americans as we have done, especially in the last 30 years, on the defense side. Now, defense spending in Europe has started to grow again since 2014, actually before Trump's time. I don't think the rise of defense spending in Europe is a consequence of Trump, although undoubtedly his pressures adds to it. And actually, my bigger concern for Europe vis-a-vis Trump is that the Article 5 guarantee in the NATO treaty has become a sort of Article 4.5. It's not really credible to think that President Trump is going to get out of bed and hearing that Russian forces have started to bring down the government in Lithuania will say, Article 5, we must stand by our Lithuanian brothers because we've got a NATO commitment. And I don't think this is going to be sort of come as a surprise to the Russians, because the Russians have been monitoring this very closely. If I was President Putin, I would see Trump's time in office, whether it's another 2 years or another 6 years, as an opportunity to really damage the credibility of NATO. And we as Europeans need to be able to not deal with a Russian nuclear strike, because that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is Russian progressive undermining of our politics and our systems so that they can do to a NATO country what they've done to Ukraine. And that is a capacity we don't have at the moment, largely because of underinvestment systematically for over 20 years in our defense capabilities. So that's one thing that we definitely need to start thinking about. We also need to think about how we can assert ourselves as a global power where we are a power in economics and in trade. And here we have real interests in finding a way to make sure that the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO remain really effective instruments of setting the rules for the global system. They're largely rules set by us and meet our interests. There was a big debate about 5 years ago about the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, AIIB, because the Chinese were getting so fed up that the Americans refused to agree to changes in China's role at the World Bank, they set up their own mini World Bank in Beijing. And who can blame them at one level? But if we want to keep the global system as it is, we have to adapt it to reflect the global balance of power as it lies. And just by mentioning the UN Security Council raises another problem that will need to be addressed at some point. So Europe has a role in trying to adapt and develop the international system so that we can preserve it, ideally for another 70 years, 75 years, beyond its present lifespan, because it's hugely in our interest that it should adapt and survive, because if it gets frozen in aspect, if it stops developing and changing, then it will not be able to survive for long and will succumb to the great power rivalry which is now emerging. And one area where the European Union is a very striking power is in regulation. Now, regulation sounds incredibly boring. But actually, I think the biggest challenge democracies face, all democracies, in the next decade, is how you bring the rule of law to the virtual world to reflect what we've achieved in the physical world. It took us basically 200 years to establish the rule of law in the physical world, so that the police and judges and the courts and parliaments established the rules, and we all benefited from adhering to those rules. The last 20 years, we've created a whole new world called the virtual world, where none of this exists. Now, the EU has started to make progress on this. In terms of control of data, there are 3 models in the world now. There's a European model, where you, the individual, controls your data. There's the American model, where the corporate controls the data. And there's a Chinese model, where the state controls the data. Now, the advantage that we have is actually the European model is the most attractive for most citizens wherever they're living. And that capacity of the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is obliging even the Facebooks and the Amazons and the Googles to adhere to European regulation, and we'll probably see some of their international operations, the Tencents and Alibabas and other Chinese global tech companies from the same course. Europe is behind in the technology game. We don't have global tech giants, and that's a shortfall for Europe. But we can harness that to some extent by devising globally acceptable regulations as to how these tech companies should be governed and how they're taxed. And I think the taxation of global corporates is another issue where the European Union is likely to take a lead rather than not. So there are strengths that Europe has that we need to build upon. So I conclude really with two thoughts, three thoughts. The first is that there are reasons to be positive, despite this huge change that's taking place around us. Here in Europe, we have strength through diversity. We have shared interests with many other middle-sized countries, whether they're like Japan or Australia or India or big Latin American countries, because none of us really want to live in a world of great powers vying with one another. We want to live in a rules-based world, but the rules have to be acceptable to all. Another reason to be positive is that Donald Trump isn't forever, he will move on in 2 years' time. I'm actually quite optimistic he won't win the next election, although the wish can be father of the thought. I think the US economy is going to move in a direction which is unhelpful for President Trump. And I think whilst he has many instincts about the world which are accurate, his capacity, his competence to produce solutions has so far been lacking. And we saw that over the closure of the US government for 3 weeks in January. Just an inability to get to a sensible solution to a problem which is genuine, but he doesn't have the political skills to get to that constructive solution. So President Trump's not forever. And China's future isn't going to be linear, in my view. I described the last 40 years since Deng Xiaoping effectively came to power in 1979, where they've just grown at a very steady rate. I don't expect the next 40 years to be like that. I think China will go through some bumps in the road, and we don't quite know how they will be managed. And I think, frankly, that historians will look back on Xi Jinping and say he set aside Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide advice 2 decades too early, and that he has engineered a confrontation with the United States at a time, if it ever was a good time, it was premature by at least a decade for Xi Jinping to do that. So there are things which, that's not necessarily a positive thought, but I don't think we should see the present trends vis-a-vis China as inexorable. But I did wonder, I had a sort of thought experiment the last couple of days. As you can tell, I'm quite an admirer of Deng Xiaoping. I think he charted the course for China in an absolutely brilliant way, and China has been hugely benefited from it. I wondered what Deng Xiaoping would advise Europe to do today if he could set out his 24-character guidance to European leaders in 2019. I think this is what he might say. Be alert to change. Act wisely and be measured in response. Address your weaknesses while acting on your strengths. Listen to your people, but lead them. Do not blindly follow them. Build for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Basically, we're very much used to the figure of James Bond who has the license to kill. Now we have an example of somebody who has the license to think, which is also allowed in certain type of services. I'm going to go to 3 important things, at least, that I hear and just want to push you on this. There was reported that when President Obama, the day he was leaving the White House, the question that he asked was, what if we were wrong? He didn't say what went wrong. Who didn't say who did wrong. It was not Hillary Clinton's what happened. And I'm saying this because the first thing that I found particularly important is that the biggest change that you believe that Europe should undergo is that we should try to change some of the assumptions that we have been thinking about the world. All these technologies that we're talking about, 10 years ago, a colleague of mine had an article calling them the liberation technologies. You remember the idea of the Facebook revolution, the idea of the Twitter revolution. All these things that basically we fear are the same things that we have been in love with just 10 years ago. And from this point of view, the problem is that what you hoped for and what you are afraid of is the same thing. And here is how not to make a mistake. Because basically, we can decide to go anti-technological, a fear of something happening, or we can decide basically to believe that technologies are going to change the world for good, nevertheless, of what is happening. And my first question is going to be very much, how politically, because you have been taking decisions, you are measuring this. Secondly, years ago, famous article in Foreign Affairs called the power shift. And people are saying the states are not important anymore. Look at the non-state actors, big companies, NGOs, global social movements. Now the states are back. But the big states are back. Bulgarian state has not been highly empowered by this. No, I'm saying this because this inequality between the big states and the small states starts to function very differently. For example, Russia can decide to have a national internet. China can do it. Probably India can do it. UN's, how many? You cannot have a Hungarian internet.
Hungary can do it.
Yeah, I do believe that they can do everything, but in my view, this is very important. This inequality between the states, which was always there, is becoming important. And my second question goes, how are we going to understand what is the sphere of influence of tomorrow? We used to know during the Cold War what is the meaning of sphere of influence. It was very much based on the nature of the political system. Before you know what is a sphere of influence, it was based on a kind of a coalitions. Is it going to be that the sphere of influence is going to be defined by the search engine that you're using? Is it going to be very much basically what kind of a search engine you are using and who is collecting your data that is going to define basically where you belong? And my third question goes to something that really kind of provokes me a lot, and this is the changing idea of what is to be strong and to be weak. There was a study being done by the Harvard scholars showing that in the last 100 years, they have been studying what they're calling asymmetrical wars. This is the wars between powers, which are very different when it comes to their military power and economic potential. And here is the news. In the beginning of the 20th century, in more than 80% of the cases, the strong states have been winning. In the last 30 years, in 53% of the cases, these are the weak states that are winning. Afghanistan and the United States. Basically, they're unmeasurable, but at the end of the day, it's difficult to say that basically the United States has prevailed when it comes to the Taliban's. And you're going here and there. So from this point of view, this is also strength-weakness story. And I'm going to end from this on Europe, because this, your position, we can regulate. Probably we can. But on the other side, for the Europe, we are preconditioned on this world order. It's not our order of choice. If this world order is not going to survive, European Union cannot survive. Mm-hmm. And my idea is how this is going to affect Europe's position.
Well, Ivan, they're three very thought-provoking questions. I think I would start by saying that technology has got no sort of moral purpose. Technology isn't good or bad, it just is. And it will be exploited by law-abiding, generous people in society. It will be exploited by the enemies of society as well. And it can be exploited for hostile purposes and criminal purposes, and sexual gratification purposes, as well as being done for conducting good business and communicating with families and friends and so on. So we shouldn't presume that the development of technology has an impact on societal goods. It just changes the way in which societal goods are built, and how the enemies of society project themselves. So that will be my first point. My second point about how great powers are different from intermediate powers. There was a complex balance under the Congress of Vienna, where you basically had 6 powers in Europe: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. And there was some form of balance between them, and they could maintain armies, they could deploy against each other. I think in the 21st century, you're really going to only have 3 great powers. There's a question mark as to whether India becomes a 4th great power. But India is not, forgive me, Shalini, India is not very good at orchestrating state power and projecting it outwards, which is the definition, really, of a great power. You've got to be able to have that capacity, which always seems to have eluded India. So I think we should project forward for the next 50 years. There are going to be 3 great powers, and they will acquire some acolytes around them. We're already seeing in China, various countries in Southeast Asia are basically throwing their lot in with China and becoming basically a satellite of China. So we should expect there to be a limited number of countries that can compete at that level. But that leaves an awful lot of countries with broadly common interests trying to survive in this jungle with 3 elephants with very heavy feet. You can be trodden on by them. That gives a pole of attraction to Europe, that you can act as a drawing force, so that what we do here in Europe is seen as actually the best way forward to protect the independence as well as the prosperity of other countries without them having to become a satellite of a different country. I think in this, it is important not to become too sort of negative about the United States. I think European attitudes towards America have been colored by the personality of Donald Trump. The reality is the interests and the values and the systems that we have in North America and Western Europe are always going to be closer to one another than we could ever want to have with Russia or with China. So our basic leaning is going to be with America, and I think that will be corrected to some extent after Trump leaves office. That sense of states coming back, though, I think is an important analysis. The global order after the Cold War developed into an order of multinational institutions, global corporations, global NGOs, who competed with governments for influence. I think global corporates remain important. Look at the energy sector, for example, which we could talk about. There's no doubt that state companies and international oil companies are going to play a crucial role in the climate transition. Global car companies are going to play the leading role in the change of mobility in the future. So global corporates will remain important. But I think multilateral institutions and multilateral pressure groups have declined in importance, and states are coming back. Now, what this means for the European Union, I think in some ways, at the cost to Britain, but Brexit has been a sort of salutary experience for the European Union, and there's no serious political party in Europe, apart from the British Conservatives, who are advocating leaving the European Union. Those in other countries which might have toyed with it, even in Italy, have backtracked. So Europe needs to benefit from that and take the advantage of it. Now, I don't know if that's answered all your questions, but it's a response anyway.
My last question before going to, and this has a lot to do with democracy, because I was reading something at the end of the 19th century, famous British thinker who said, monarchy is the only form of government that people in the world understands today. It was 19th century, and in a certain way he was right. we are taking certain type of a historical form of government, and I'm going to talk not about monarchy but about democracy. It's taken for granted. You go and you believe that basically because democracy is here, it's going to stay. And in my view, part of the problem with China is not ideological in the way it was with the Soviet Union, but here is the case. If they're going to be authoritarian regimes used to have one major vulnerability, all of them. And this is because they want to control the information. They create a police apparatus which is starting basically to distort the information. So the more police apparatus you have, the least you're understanding what is happening in your own society. And the GDR was the great example of this. You have the Stasi, the most sophisticated police machine ever being created. And then basically you ended up with the government of GDR not understanding what is happening there. The problem with the big data is that you do not need the same type of a police apparatus in order to control. For example, the good news about China is nobody is going to inform on other people because all of us are informing on ourselves. Every day, basically, you're informing on what you're reading, what you're buying, whom you are dating. All this is in a big data. So from this point of view, you're governing through patterns. And this created a level of competitiveness that democracies didn't have before. And I do believe that the biggest problem for us, and this is why I go, is that to such an extent, the advantage of the democracy as a political regime is in our DNA, that we are really even not daring to ask the questions under what kind of historical conditions this is true. And this is why, in my view, China scares us. This is why Russia on a totally different level scares us, because for the first time, the question is, could it be that we have been very much competitive in this industrial and post-industrial age, and now comes people who govern differently, which totally redefine what is the idea of freedom. For example, we talk about privacy. Is the idea of the privacy the same for the millennials, which are putting all of their information there, with the previous generations? To what extent we are ready really to ask ourselves the tough questions about the most valued institutions that we have. Yeah. So this is...
Well, I think you're right, and I touched on that in my talk, on both points, that the new technology makes a surveilled, controlled society easier to run with less violence. So it becomes, in a sense, more acceptable to mainstream people. I remember giving a talk in Beijing at Peking University a few years ago, before I was at MI6, and the students there, they were hand-picked because they were talking to Westerners, but at least they're vetted. But they said, we follow your democratic system very closely, but it couldn't possibly work in China because stability is so essential for us at this stage. And if you allow the mass of Chinese people to express their views and shape the government, you won't like what you see. Which is quite a thought-provoking way of arguing for their system. But it's not as if China is, as I say, it was gradually moving in our direction. It has now sharply moved against our direction and has provided a model for many other countries in the same way. And even in democracies, like the United States, like Brazil, like to some extent India and Japan, leaders have been elected who in some ways are bigger than their parties. And that the support for people like Shinzo Abe and Narendra Modi and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil comes directly from the electorate rather than through the elective process of choosing representatives in parliament. And one of the challenges we face in Europe is how we maintain the rule by an educated and informed elite with the consent of ordinary people. Because if you take out that rule by the educated and informed elite, then you have the masses directing populist leaders, usually in a very unhelpful direction.
Thank you very much. So we are now for the most interesting part of it. The floor is yours. the world is very unstable.
The world is very unstable. I was trying to see everybody, but who's going to start?
Yeah.
Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you. Sir John, having you in Vienna, it's inevitable to talk about Brexit just for a moment.
Yeah.
But not in the usual way with this hype of the present discussion, etc. I think questions of defense, security, and intelligence have been put on the back burner in all this hype which prevails today. It was very interesting that in September 2 years ago, in 2017, the British government has issued a declaration, a political declaration, and this was after of course, after the referendum of Brexit, offering to the European Union, the EU 27, a full continuous cooperation in the fields of defense, security, and intelligence, where Britain really had been leading. Now, would you agree with me saying that the EU 27, after Brexit, or irrespective of Brexit, would be well advised to accept the offer by Britain and really in these three fields to cooperate to the fullest extent possible? Thank you.
Yeah, well, my answer to that is very much yes. I do think it is in both the interests of Europe and the interests of Britain to have a very close security partnership. And the nature of modern security is that, you know, for Britain, we can't start protecting British people at Dover. There is cross-border threats, whether it's terrorism or cyber or organized crime. And I think you're right that, well, I know you're right, that the contribution made by British intelligence and law enforcement and armed forces is a net contribution to Europe's stability and defense. And it would be a massive act of self-harm if that was lost in this process of Brexit. You can tell from my comments, I think Brexit is a strategic mistake by my country. I think it could be managed, but unfortunately we have a political leadership which is, doesn't seem to have the ability, agility, or imagination to find a political way through this at the moment. And the reality is, the harder the Brexit, the greater the damage to my country, and also the greater the damage to the European Union. And the harder it will be to create the sort of cooperation that you're talking about that is, it's a no-brainer for anybody who's worked in intelligence and security, that we enhance our security by working with one another rather than in separate stovepipes. And that's true within a country, and it's true between countries as well. So I very much endorse your sentiment.
Thank you. Please, questions, comments? Yusuf, please.
Africa,
Yeah.
threat or opportunity?
I think Africa is undoubtedly a massive opportunity for years ahead. It is still struggling. I spent 6 years of my career at different ends of Africa, in South Africa and in Egypt. And it's a continent which is still struggling with weak institutions, with greedy politicians. But it's interesting how technology is changing Africa. We saw it 15 years ago with the advent of the mobile phone, and how Africa just leapfrogged a whole generation of technology. You don't have landlines in Africa, you just have mobile phones. And the rest of the world is catching up with Africa in that regard. We're seeing it with energy production. Energy and electric power has traditionally come with big power stations and great big infrastructure and heavy lines. It now comes from a little sort of solar energy turbine which keeps your lights on and your air conditioning going. And that will be transformative in Africa. And Africa is going to have a very dynamic demography in years to come. And the challenge for Europe is that it should be a demography that wants to stay in Africa and make Africa a success, rather than come across the Mediterranean and make a success in Europe. So that's the big challenge there. As with all things, you can identify the opportunities, you can identify the threats. But if you see Africa as a threat and you put up the barriers and you resist African development, it's actually going to make things worse. Somehow we have to create the transformation in Africa that we've seen in my lifetime in India and more recently in China, where you go from basically the norm being poverty and an underdevelopment and struggle to one where the norm becomes decent living standards, opportunity, education, and growth. And that's not impossible. When I was a child, my parents always told me to eat up the food on my plate, because just think of all those starving children in India. Now, no one would think about starving children in India, although there are still starving children in India. They think about starving children in Africa. Some of the biggest successes in the world have come in the last 50 years, have come through the massive development we've seen in the world's two most populous countries. You can do it again in Africa, and it will be hugely in our interest if we succeed.
Thank you. Please.
You said that you have some doubts whether the market-based democracies will succeed in the future systemic competition as they did in the last one. And I would just mention that there was always one argument, at least in economist circles, that would have argued for this success, which is the ability to create innovations, which is very much a feature of market-based democracies, because in any kind of authoritative system, you would always fear that the leadership will extract your gains from your innovation, and therefore you will not invest into any kind of innovation activities. The question is whether you think that the systems like we see now in Russia or China still would create a framework for enterprises to innovate successfully, or whether they will go down that very other road of authoritarian regimes.
Yeah.
And then also to add on this, you mentioned this kind of illiberal democracies that we see now, but there's also a discussion now emerging that maybe there is something like undemocratic liberalism. And whether the undemocratic liberalism has led to the situation that you described yourself very well, that the median wages in America, for example, have not really risen for the last 30 or 40 years, and whether that's also a systemic danger to these systems.
Yeah. Well, you raise some interesting points there. And don't get me wrong, I really want market economies and liberal democracies to thrive and survive. And I only raise this because I don't believe we can assume they're going to be successful and they're going to thrive in the way that we were able to do that, especially since the end of the Cold War, but actually for most of the lifetimes of everybody in this room. There's just been a presumption that liberal democracy and market economics is better than any alternative. You cannot make, with the same degree of confidence, that same assumption now. I think you're right. I think it was the allocation of capital and the capacity to innovate and experiment which made the market economic system the success it was. But for the reasons that Ivan was setting out earlier about how technology has evolved, what I was saying earlier about China no longer getting its technology just by cyber theft and reverse engineering, it's actually developing its own technology in a different way. Yes, with massive state subsidies, yes, directing people into areas which is the state's priorities. It's not a market system at all, but they are having some success. The rewards in a communist, China is still a communist country with, socialism with Chinese characteristics. But it's communist in the sense there is one organization which is in power, and that has become even more powerful under Xi Jinping than it was under his two predecessors, and that's the Communist Party. That they find ways of rewarding success and punishing dissent and failure, which is different from ours. But nonetheless, it has some traction in China and is effective there. So my answer is, yes, you're onto an important point. And it's not easy to create an innovative society. And in a small way, when I was chief of MI6, one of my goals was to try to create an innovative atmosphere and environment within the service so that experimentation was encouraged and in some ways failure was encouraged, especially the way we did things. Try new technology in new ways. And it's not straightforward, especially in a hierarchical organization which has military origins, to think in an innovative way and create that spirit of innovation. But I think we made some progress. And I think the West generally is hugely reinforced by that spirit of innovation. But we shouldn't assume, as we have for most of the last 50 years, that it will prevail. And what's the biggest online retailer in the world? I'm afraid it's not Amazon. It's Alibaba. And Tencent is just as big a company and just as powerful a company as Google, and the Chinese have their own Facebook, I can't remember what it's called now, which is as dynamic and innovative as the Western Facebook. And they've devised this themselves. They've not stolen Western technology and just exploited it. So I don't think Russia's the same sort of threat. But you look at what Russia did in the Cold War, the Soviet Union did in the Cold War, they matched Western military developments step by step, a bit through espionage and stealing secrets, but most of it by their own innovation. State-driven innovation shouldn't be underestimated. And we face a challenge in terms of our system, and we need to, as I say, we have to be aware of change in the world. And one of the changes in the world is that those advantages that our system has had over centrally command and control systems has been reduced. And there's greater equality between those systems in terms of outputs. Obviously not in terms of freedoms, obviously not in terms of balances within society and checks and balances, but nonetheless in terms of orchestrating state power and projecting it, there is some degree of equality there.
Thank you very much. Let's go for the last question, please.
The Brits are getting good opportunities here.
Yes.
The Brexit has prompted remarkable unity amongst the EU 27. How do you see the prospects for the euro as and when the Brexit drama is settled one way or the other?
For the what? For the euro?
For the euro, because
yeah.
It seems to me that this will have a very significant effect on the EU's ability to play the role that you set forth for it.
Well, one of the tragedies of Brexit is that Britain had the best deal of any country in Europe. We weren't part of the euro, and I think the euro is a fascinating project, but it's half complete. And it's striking how the euro has hugely benefited Germany and other fiscally disciplined countries, and hugely penalized southern countries like Italy and Greece and to some extent France, because it's basically diminished Germany is operating on a lower exchange rate than it would normally do. So its export-led industries have hugely benefited. I don't think Brexit will really impact a great deal on the development of the euro. I think in some ways the shock of Brexit has galvanized a sense in Europe that some of these half-finished projects need to be completed at some stage. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 25 years' time, or 30 years' time, say 2050, you did have a Europe of concentric circles, and Britain was back in the second circle of that concentric, and the inner circle was actually a fairly small number of countries, of which Austria would probably be one, and Germany would be at the center of it, and Netherlands and so on. Big question mark is whether France is part of it. It probably will be. But you could see a role for other countries around the periphery of that. But going back to Brexit itself, I don't think it helps the European Union. And my German friends tell me that Germany's weight in the European Union will be greater after Brexit, because Britain won't be there, but its influence will be less, because Britain was quite often the country which was out there advocating free market, open government systems, which Germany can neatly tuck in behind. And now Germany doesn't have that luxury of being able to be the center ground for compromise in the European Union. It now has to be on one end of the spectrum. So I think that's one case. And with France, Britain and France always was able to establish an outward-looking, assertive European approach in the world, because we were the two sort of global, two European powers with a global perspective. And now France is going to be on its own. And of course, France and Germany are, have a very dynamic and important relationship, although it's coming under a bit of strain at the moment, frankly. Basically, Europe's got lots of institutions, but those institutions have been held up by a three-legged stool of Berlin, Paris, and London. And we're just kicking one of those legs away. And two-legged stools are not terribly stable.
Thank you very much. It's, there was a book recently published with the title, it was In Spies We Trust. I do believe in the moment in which really the level of mistrust is so high, this is what we should do. But I'm very grateful for John starting this conversation, because one of the things that in a certain way at least we had as an ambition with these talks, and the Ministry of Defense have been very much supportive for this, is we used to live in a world which in my view is not here anymore. We can discuss why it's not there, we can discuss who is responsible for this, but the world has changed a lot. There was an important psychological experiment. You're showing to a person in a very quick succession drawings of a cat. And you're asking him, what does he see? And he's saying he's seeing cats and cats and cats. And then you start to mix cats with dogs. And you're asking what he sees. And he continues to claim that he sees cats. And then somebody shouts his name, distracts him. And when he's back, he starts to see the dogs. The dogs have been there before, but we have not seen them. And I do believe that with Brexit, with Trump, this was like shouting somebody's name. This was a distraction that showed us that the world has changed. And in a certain way, we should frame it differently. And here the problem is, what is the frame? So allow me to thank you, John, helping us to frame it differently.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.